Welcome to our channel, where we explore history's darkest, strangest, and most unforgettable chapters. Tonight we begin a long journey into Victorian London, a city of empire and progress on the surface, yet filth, disease, and decay beneath its streets. In this story, you'll discover why the world once called London the dirtiest city on earth, how everyday life unfolded among overflowing sewage, choking smoke, rotting food, and crowded slums, and how millions of ordinary people tried to survive inside a city that was slowly poisoning itself. Before we go any further, please subscribe to the channel and like this video if you enjoy slow, detailed history stories like this one. And tell us in the comments from which location you're watching. It's always fascinating to see where these stories travel across the world. Victorian London was a city of contradictions. It was the heart of the largest empire the world had ever seen. A place of innovation, wealth, railways, factories, and global trade. But for all its power and prosperity, London was also drowning in its own waste. By the mid-19th century, more than 2 million people were packed into a city that had never been designed to handle such numbers. Streets built for horses and carts now carried endless traffic, markets spilled into alleyways, and entire families were crammed into single damp rooms. The city grew faster than sanitation, planning, or common sense could keep up. Cleanliness as we understand it today barely existed for most Londoners. Running water was rare, especially in poor neighborhoods. Toilets were a luxury. Instead, most homes relied on cesspits, deep holes beneath houses that collected human waste. These pits were often never emptied properly. When they overflowed, the filth seeped into walls, floors, and nearby wells. Drinking water frequently came from the same ground contaminated by sewage. People didn't fully understand germs yet, so the connection between waste and disease remained a mystery to many. The streets themselves were another nightmare. London's roads were coated in layers of mud, animal dung, rotting food, and industrial waste. Horses were everywhere, pulling carts, buses, and carriages, and each horse produced large amounts of manure every day. This manure piled up in the streets, mixing with rainwater and turning roads into foul-smelling rivers of filth. In dry weather, the manure dried into dust and filled the air. In wet weather, it became thick sludge that soaked into shoes and clothing. Markets added another layer of decay. Butchers slaughtered animals in open stalls, letting blood run into the streets. Fishmongers dumped spoiled fish where they stood. Vegetable waste, bones, and scraps were often left to rot where they fell. Rats thrived in these conditions, growing bold and numerous. They crawled through homes, markets, and sewers, spreading disease and fear. For many Londoners, rats were as familiar as cats or dogs. The Thames River, once a source of pride, became the city's most disgusting symbol. London used the Thames as its main sewer. Human waste, industrial chemicals, slaughterhouse remains, and garbage were all dumped directly into the river. Water companies still drew drinking water from the Thames, often downstream from sewage outlets. The river became thick, dark, and foul-smelling. Dead animals floated past busy docks. In hot weather, the stench was so overpowering that people covered their noses with cloths soaked in vinegar. Factories worsened everything. The Industrial Revolution brought coal-powered machines, and London burned enormous amounts of coal every day. Thick black smoke poured from chimneys, covering buildings in soot. The air was constantly hazy, and sunlight struggled to break through. This smoke settled on everything: food, clothing, lungs. Breathing in Victorian London meant inhaling a mixture of coal dust, sewage fumes, and industrial pollution. Coughing was common. Lung diseases were widespread. Many people never knew what it felt like to breathe clean air. Housing conditions made the filth impossible to escape. In the poorest districts, entire families lived in single rooms with no ventilation. Garbage was often stored indoors because there was nowhere else to put it. Chamber pots, used as toilets, were emptied into the street or nearby drains. Washing was infrequent, not only because water was scarce, but because heating water required time, fuel, and money. Clothes were worn until they fell apart. Bodies were rarely bathed. The smell of sweat, waste, smoke, and decay clung to people wherever they went. Children grew up surrounded by dirt. They played in streets filled with waste, slept in damp rooms, and drank polluted water. Many never reached adulthood. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery swept through neighborhoods with terrifying speed. Entire families could be wiped out within days. Yet many Victorians believed these illnesses were caused by bad air or miasma, rather than contaminated water. This belief delayed meaningful action and allowed the city's filth to continue unchecked. Even wealth could not fully protect people. While the rich lived in cleaner areas and larger homes, they still traveled through filthy streets and breathed polluted air. Servants carried dirt indoors on their clothes. Food markets supplied spoiled goods. The Thames stench reached Parliament itself. London's filth did not respect class boundaries. It only punished the poor more severely. Despite all this, life went on. People adapted. They held handkerchiefs to their faces, sprinkled lime over waste, and burned incense to mask smells. Newspapers complained endlessly about the filth, but solutions were slow and expensive. City officials argued. Engineers proposed ambitious sewer systems. Politicians delayed action. Meanwhile, London kept growing, and the dirt kept piling up. By the middle of the 19th century, the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Visitors from abroad were shocked. Writers and journalists described London as a nightmare of smoke and stench. The phrase, "the dirtiest city in the world," was not an exaggeration. It was a warning. A city that ruled half the globe could not even manage its own waste. And still, beneath the grime and decay, millions of people lived, worked, loved, and dreamed. Shopkeepers opened their stalls each morning. Children laughed in the streets. Workers poured into factories at dawn. Victorian London was filthy. Yes, but it was also alive, restless, and unstoppable. In the next part of this story, we'll step deeper into the city's slums, exploring how overcrowding and poverty turned dirt into disaster, and how entire neighborhoods became breeding grounds for disease and despair. In the mid-19th century, as the squalor and filth of Victorian London continued to grow, some individuals and groups began to push back against the prevailing ignorance and neglect of the poor and the city's deteriorating infrastructure. Reform was not quick to come, but over time, the pressures for change grew too strong to ignore. As London's population exploded and the city became synonymous with disease, filth, and despair, a series of health and sanitation reforms began to emerge that would forever alter the city's future. The road to improvement was long and arduous, but it was a beginning that would slowly clean the streets, reduce disease, and transform London from the world's dirtiest city into one of the most advanced cities of the modern era. The turning point came with the outbreak of cholera in the mid-1800s. Cholera, which had been a recurring threat in Europe, became a deadly epidemic in London, killing thousands each time it appeared. The connection between poor sanitation and disease was not immediately understood, but the recurring outbreaks of cholera in the city forced public attention to the city's unsanitary conditions, and the need for reform became undeniable. The man who would eventually revolutionize London's sanitation system was Dr. John Snow, a physician who is often regarded as one of the founding figures of modern epidemiology. In 1854, a massive cholera outbreak occurred in Soho, an area of central London. Dr. Snow, working on the theory that cholera was spread through contaminated water rather than air, meticulously traced the outbreak's source to a public water pump on Broad Street. By analyzing the locations of those who fell ill and conducting a careful investigation, Snow proved that cholera was being transmitted through water, not bad air or miasma. His work led to a critical shift in the understanding of how diseases spread and laid the foundation for modern public health reform. However, even as Dr. Snow made his discoveries, London's sanitation systems remained woefully inadequate. The city's sewer systems were outdated, and most of the waste was either dumped into the streets or directly into the Thames River, the very source of much of the city's drinking water. Raw sewage, mixed with waterborne diseases, created a vicious cycle, where the city's inhabitants became both the victims and unwitting contributors to the pollution. Infectious diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever were rampant. As Dr. Snow's theories gained traction, the urgency for reform grew, but real change would take years. In the same decade that Snow's work was making waves in public health, another figure emerged who would become pivotal in the fight for sanitation reform. Sir Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer whose contributions would reshape the landscape of London itself. Bazalgette was tasked with designing a new sewer system to address the crisis. He recognized that the old sewers, simple open drains that ran along the streets, were not sufficient for a rapidly expanding city. In fact, they were actively contributing to the spread of disease. His plan involved constructing a vast underground system of sewers that would channel waste away from the city and into the Thames, but far enough away from the city's drinking water intake to prevent contamination. Bazalgette's design was a monumental undertaking that would take years to complete. The sewer system, completed in the early 1860s, was a triumph of engineering. It was a system that could carry London's waste away safely, without the need for cesspits or open sewers. The sewers ran for hundreds of miles, and Bazalgette's work became the model for modern urban sanitation systems. The cleaner streets and improved public health were immediate benefits, but the long-term impact of Bazalgette's work cannot be overstated. His sewer system helped to eliminate cholera outbreaks, reduce the spread of disease, and laid the foundation for the urban planning that would follow in other cities across the globe. At the same time, the city began to improve its waste management systems. The introduction of regular garbage collection and more sanitary waste disposal methods reduced the accumulation of refuse on the streets. New laws were passed to regulate the cleaning of public spaces, and many of the poorest areas of London, once mired in filth, began to experience cleaner, healthier conditions. He passed to regulate the cleaning of public spaces, and many of the poorest areas of London, once mired in filth, began to experience cleaner, healthier conditions. In addition to improvements in sanitation, the Victorian era saw the development of a more structured approach to public health. Public health boards were established to monitor the spread of disease and enforce hygiene standards. The city's hospitals grew larger and more equipped to deal with the health crises that had plagued London for so long. These reforms slowly but surely improved life for the poor, who had been disproportionately affected by the city's filth and disease. The work of public health pioneers laid the groundwork for the National Health Service, NHS, which would be established much later in the 20th century. While sanitation was perhaps the most urgent reform, housing conditions for the working poor were also addressed. The Victorian era saw the rise of slum clearances and the building of better housing for those in the worst conditions. Though these efforts were far from perfect, they were an essential part of improving the quality of life for the lower classes. Victorian philanthropists like Octavia Hill and Charles Booth worked to improve housing for the poor, organizing the construction of new model housing that offered better conditions than the overcrowded slums in which so many had lived. These new developments were small steps forward in the fight for social equity, though many poor Londoners still lived in appalling conditions for years to come. Meanwhile, the industrial landscape of London was also undergoing a transformation. As new methods of transportation, like horse-drawn trams and later electric streetcars, became more common, the city's street-level pollution began to lessen. Industrial pollution, though still an issue, began to be managed more effectively with better urban planning and regulations. By the late Victorian period, London had started to shift toward a cleaner, more organized city. But the impact of pollution and overcrowding remained a central issue in public health debates. However, the changes in sanitation and public health were not without their challenges. Social inequality was still deeply entrenched in London, and many of the working poor found it difficult to access the benefits of the reforms. Poor housing and overcrowding remained a significant issue for much of the population, particularly in the East End, where poverty was most concentrated. The gap between the rich and the poor persisted, with the wealthy enjoying the benefits of cleaner streets, better health care, and more secure living conditions, while the poor still struggled to survive in the shadows of the city. But despite these inequalities, the reforms of the mid to late Victorian era marked a turning point in the history of London. The sewer systems, improved waste management, and growing awareness of the importance of sanitation transformed the city into a much cleaner and healthier place. The advancements made in public health and infrastructure would shape the future of cities worldwide. It was not an instantaneous change, nor was it perfect. But Victorian London, with all its grime and disease, gradually transformed into a city that could, in time, become the model for modern urban health and living standards. As the sanitation and public health reforms began to take shape in Victorian London, the city started to experience a transformation, one that reached beyond just cleaner streets and improved infrastructure. These changes began to affect the daily lives of the working-class population, whose lives had been most heavily impacted by the city's filth and disease. Yet, while the reforms helped alleviate some of the most immediate threats to public health, they also exposed deeper issues of social inequality, class division, and the struggles of the poor in a rapidly changing world. The improvements in sanitation, such as the construction of Baselget's sewer system and the increased regulation of waste and garbage, provided much-needed relief from the constant threat of disease. The reduction in cholera outbreaks, once a regular and deadly feature of life in London, was a clear sign of progress. However, the social divide between the wealthy and the poor remained stark, and the benefits of these reforms were not always equally shared. While the upper classes in their grand homes were largely insulated from the worst effects of disease and poverty, the working-class population still faced many challenges. One of the most profound impacts of the reforms was in the area of housing. The Victorian era was marked by overcrowded slums, particularly in the East End of London, where thousands of working-class families lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions. Although the introduction of model housing and slum clearance programs by philanthropists like Octavia Hill and Charles Booth improved conditions for some, the vast majority of the poor were still forced to live in overcrowded and poorly constructed homes. These homes were often poorly ventilated, damp, and lacked access to basic sanitation. In fact, even as the sewer systems improved, many homes in the slums had no indoor plumbing, and the idea of a private bathroom was far out of reach for most families. The increased awareness of the importance of sanitation and hygiene brought about by the reforms did little to alleviate the deep-seated class divisions that continued to exist in the city. While wealthier citizens could afford to live in cleaner, better-constructed homes in more affluent areas, the poor were left behind in the slums. Social housing, or public housing that could have served as a safety net for the working poor, was still largely underdeveloped, and the government was slow to address the housing crisis. Those living in the slums continued to face overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, and poor living conditions long after the improvements in the city's infrastructure were made. The impact of these social inequalities was felt most acutely by women and children in the working class. As household laborers, women in the working-class communities of Victorian London often found themselves performing both paid work in factories or service jobs and unpaid domestic labor at home. The poorest families could not afford to hire servants or buy the necessary tools to run their homes efficiently. Instead, they relied on women and children to take on the bulk of the labor, often working long hours in extremely difficult conditions. Children, particularly, were expected to contribute to the household's income, even if it meant working in dangerous and unhealthy environments like chimney sweeping, factory work, and coal mining. For these children, the reforms that improved the sanitation of the streets and the removal of waste from the city did little to change the physical toll of hard labor. While child labor laws were passed in the late 19th century, limiting the number of hours children could work and banning the employment of children under a certain age, these laws were not always enforced, and many children still worked long hours in factories and mines. Child labor remained a significant issue throughout much of the Victorian era, even as public health and sanitation improved. The Victorian ideal of respectability also perpetuated the social inequality between the classes. The middle and upper classes adhered to a set of moral and social codes that emphasized personal responsibility, hard work, and cleanliness. These values were used to justify the marginalization and punishment of the working poor. The poor were often blamed for their circumstances, with their living conditions deemed a reflection of their laziness or moral failings. The idea of the poor being undeserving of public assistance was prevalent, and the poor were left to fend for themselves, even as the government and the wealthy elite made small strides in improving the public infrastructure. While some reforms did provide basic welfare services, such as the establishment of the National Health Service and public health initiatives, these efforts were not enough to address the root causes of poverty and inequality in Victorian London. Many working-class families were still left with little access to quality education, healthcare, and social mobility. The working poor were often trapped in a cycle of poverty, with few opportunities for improvement. Child labor, poor housing, and lack of access to basic services ensured that many families could not escape the hardships they faced. Despite these challenges, the working class continued to show remarkable resilience and community strength. The growth of trade unions and workers' movements during the Victorian era was one of the most significant social changes of the period. These movements fought for better wages, safer working conditions, and better treatment of workers. The Labour Party emerged as a political force in the late 19th century, advocating for the rights of the working class and pushing for social reforms that would benefit the poor. Through their collective efforts, the working class began to challenge the status quo and fight for better conditions, both in the workplace and in society as a whole. At the same time, the philanthropic efforts of individuals like Octavia Hill, Charles Booth, and George Peabody began to make a difference in the lives of some of the working poor. These reformers advocated for better housing, cleaner streets, and improved living conditions for the poor. They recognized the deep social inequalities that existed in Victorian society and worked to address them through their charitable efforts. While their work was often limited in scope, these individuals helped to lay the groundwork for the modern welfare state that would emerge in the 20th century. Though these reforms marked an important shift in the way that the working poor were viewed by society, much of the victim-blaming mentality persisted. The poor continued to be portrayed as lazy or morally deficient, and their squalid living conditions were often seen as a reflection of their character. While the sanitation reforms and public health measures were important, they could not address the deep-seated inequalities that existed in Victorian society. As we move forward in the story of London's transformation, we will see how the public health revolution gave way to welfare state policies that would better protect the working poor. The struggle for equality and better living conditions would continue well into the 20th century, ultimately changing the way that society and government viewed the welfare of the poor. As the late Victorian era moved toward the end of the 19th century, the changes brought about by sanitation reforms began to ripple outward in ways that few had initially anticipated. What started as an attempt to control disease and filth slowly reshaped how cities were built, governed, and imagined. Victorian London, once overwhelmed by waste and decay, became a living experiment in how human settlements could adapt to industrial growth. The lessons learned in its streets, sewers, and slums would influence not only Britain, but cities around the world. One of the most important long-term effects of Victorian reforms was the birth of modern urban planning. Before this period, cities grew organically, with little thought given to airflow, waste disposal, or population density. Streets twisted unpredictably. Housing was built wherever space allowed, and infrastructure followed as an afterthought, if it appeared at all. The horrors of disease outbreaks forced officials to recognize that cities could no longer be left to grow unchecked. Health, order, and efficiency became matters of public responsibility rather than private concern. Gradually, London began to be reshaped by new ideas. Streets were widened to allow light and air to circulate. Open drains were covered or replaced with underground systems. New housing developments were designed with ventilation in mind, a radical concept at the time. Parks and green spaces were introduced not merely for beauty, but as a response to the understanding that clean air and open land were essential to physical and mental health. These spaces offered working-class families brief escapes from overcrowded neighborhoods and gave children places to play away from filth-filled streets. Public health itself became a recognized field. Medical officers were appointed to monitor neighborhoods, inspect housing, and track outbreaks of disease. Statistics began to matter. Death rates, infant mortality, and life expectancy were carefully recorded and analyzed. For the first time, policymakers could see clear evidence that poor sanitation led directly to illness and death. This data-driven approach transformed how governments responded to crises. Disease was no longer viewed purely as divine punishment or moral failure, but increasingly as a problem that could be measured, managed, and prevented. Education played a crucial role in reinforcing these changes. As schooling became more accessible, children learned basic principles of hygiene that their parents had never been taught. Washing hands, cleaning living spaces, and avoiding contaminated water slowly became common knowledge rather than rare practices. While poverty still limited what families could realistically achieve, awareness alone marked a significant shift. A generation was growing up with a different understanding of health, cleanliness, and responsibility. The city's relationship with the Thames also began to change. Once treated as an open sewer, the river slowly regained its importance as a managed waterway rather than a dumping ground. New embankments reshaped its banks, controlling flooding and improving transportation routes. Though pollution did not disappear overnight, the idea that a river should be protected rather than abused represented a major change in thinking. Water was no longer infinite or disposable. It was a resource that required stewardship. These developments also altered how governments viewed their role in citizens' lives. Victorian authorities had long resisted intervention, believing that individuals should manage their own welfare. But the scale of London's problems made this stance impossible to maintain. Disease did not respect class boundaries. Smoke drifted into wealthy districts. Epidemics crossed neighborhood lines. Gradually, the belief took hold that public health was a shared responsibility. This shift laid the groundwork for future welfare policies, housing regulations, and environmental laws. However, progress remained uneven. While central areas of London improved, many working-class neighborhoods continued to suffer. Slum clearance projects often displaced families without offering affordable alternatives. Entire communities were uprooted in the name of improvement, pushing the poor farther from employment and support networks. For some, reforms felt less like a rescue and more like erasure. The city looked cleaner on the surface, but the struggles of the poor did not vanish. They were simply relocated. Industrial pollution also remained a persistent problem. Coal continued to power factories, trains, and homes. Smoke-darkened skies were still a common sight, and respiratory illnesses remained widespread. Though sanitation reforms addressed waste and water, air pollution lagged behind as a serious concern. Victorians accepted smoke as the price of progress, unaware of the long-term damage it caused to lungs, buildings, and ecosystems. True environmental awareness was still decades away. Yet even with these limitations, Victorian London had changed fundamentally. The idea that cities could and should be designed to support human health became increasingly accepted. Other cities across Britain and Europe studied London's sewer system and adopted similar approaches. What had once been a symbol of failure slowly became a model for reform. Social attitudes evolved as well. The visibility of poverty and disease, once hidden or ignored, became central to public debate. Newspapers published investigations into housing conditions. Writers and reformers continued to expose injustice. Ordinary citizens, armed with better information, began to demand accountability from those in power. The seeds of civic engagement were planted, growing into movements that would shape the 20th century. By the closing decades of the Victorian era, London stood at a crossroads. It was cleaner than it had been, healthier than before, and better organized, but still deeply unequal. The city had proven that filth and disease were not inevitable, yet it had not solved the deeper problem of poverty. Sanitation could remove waste from streets, but it could not erase hunger, overcrowding, or exploitation. Those challenges would require new ideas, new laws, and new ways of thinking about society itself. As the century drew toward its end, London's transformation was incomplete, but irreversible. The worst excesses of filth had been confronted. The connection between environment and health had been established, and the city, once infamous for its stench and sickness, had begun the slow journey toward becoming a modern metropolis. City, once infamous for its stench and sickness, had begun the slow journey toward becoming a modern metropolis. As Victorian London continued its slow transformation, the changes in infrastructure began to seep into the rhythms of everyday life. Cleanliness was no longer just an abstract idea discussed by engineers and politicians. It started to shape how ordinary people moved through the city. how they cared for their homes, and how they understood health and survival. These shifts did not happen overnight, and for many Londoners, especially the poor, they were subtle, uneven, and often frustratingly incomplete. Daily routines began to change first. In neighborhoods where new water pumps and improved drainage were installed, families noticed fewer foul smells and less standing waste in the streets. Washing, once a rare and exhausting task, slowly became more common where water access improved. Public washhouses opened in some districts, allowing working-class families to clean clothes and bodies more regularly. These places were crowded and noisy, but they represented progress, a recognition that cleanliness should not be reserved for the wealthy alone. Markets, too, began to change. New regulations required vendors to dispose of waste properly and avoid selling spoiled food. While enforcement was inconsistent, the very existence of such rules marked a shift in priorities. Food safety, once largely ignored, became a topic of concern. People grew more aware of the connection between what they consumed and how they felt afterward. Though germs were still poorly understood, experience taught harsh lessons, and memory lingered long after outbreaks faded. Children growing up in this transitional period experienced a city different from that of their parents. Streets were still dirty, but not quite as deadly. The constant fear of sudden cholera outbreaks began to ease. Schools, where available, reinforced ideas about hygiene, order, and discipline. For some children, cleanliness became part of moral education. Washing hands, keeping clothes neat, and avoiding filth were framed not only as healthy practices, but as signs of respectability. This blending of hygiene and morality shaped attitudes for generations. Yet, improvement came with tension. Many working-class families viewed new regulations with suspicion. Inspections felt intrusive. Orders to clean homes or move out of condemned buildings were often issued without offering alternatives. For people already living on the edge of survival, reform sometimes felt like punishment disguised as progress. Being told that their homes were unfit to live in did little to help when no affordable housing existed elsewhere. The memory of filth, however, remained powerful. Older residents remembered the worst years, the overpowering smells, the river thick with waste, the sudden deaths that struck without warning. These memories influenced how people responded to change. Some embraced reforms eagerly, desperate never to return to those conditions. Others resisted, wary of authorities who had ignored their suffering for decades and now claimed to act in their interest. Public spaces began to reflect new values. Streets were swept more regularly in central areas. Gas lighting improved visibility, making dirt harder to hide and crime easier to spot. Parks and promenades became symbols of civic pride, places where Londoners could experience a cleaner version of their city, even if only briefly. These spaces also reinforced class divisions, as some areas were carefully maintained while poorer districts lagged behind. Health outcomes slowly improved. Infant mortality rates declined, though they remained high by modern standards. Life expectancy crept upward. Doctors and officials began to understand patterns, how overcrowding, poor ventilation, and contaminated water worked together to weaken bodies. Hospitals expanded, and charity clinics offered limited care to the poor. Medicine remained crude, but it was becoming more systematic, more focused on prevention rather than reaction alone. The city's workforce adapted as well. Cleaner streets made transport more efficient. Improved drainage reduced flooding, allowing goods to move more reliably. These changes supported economic growth, reinforcing the idea that public health was not merely a moral issue but an economic necessity. A healthier population worked more consistently, cost less to treat, and posed fewer risks to social stability. Despite these gains, inequality remained deeply rooted. While some districts flourished, others stayed trapped in cycles of neglect. The East End, in particular, continued to struggle with overcrowding, low wages, and poor housing. Reform efforts often targeted visible problems while ignoring underlying causes. Filth could be swept away. Poverty could not. Many families continued to live one illness or job loss away from disaster. Cultural attitudes toward dirt also evolved. Filth was no longer accepted as inevitable, but it was still closely associated with poverty. Cleanliness became a marker of respectability, reinforcing social hierarchies. Those who failed to meet new standards were often judged harshly, even when circumstances made compliance nearly impossible. This moralization of cleanliness added a new layer to class prejudice. As the Victorian era approached its end, London existed in a state of uneasy balance. It was cleaner, healthier, and better organized than before, yet haunted by the memory of its past. The city had learned hard lessons about neglect and consequence. It had discovered that progress without planning could be deadly. These lessons would shape future policies, influencing how cities across the world approached growth, sanitation, and public health. Still, many questions remained unresolved. How far should the government intervene in private lives? Who should bear the cost of reform? Could cleanliness truly coexist with poverty, or would one always undermine the other? These debates simmered beneath the surface as London moved into a new century. As London stepped beyond the Victorian era and into the early years of the 20th century, the city carried its past with it like a shadow that never fully faded. The worst of the visible filth had been reduced, but the memory of overflowing streets, poisoned water, and choking air lingered deeply in the public consciousness. These memories shaped how Londoners thought about their city, and how future generations approached the idea of urban life itself. The reforms born from Victorian desperation did not simply disappear when Queen Victoria's reign ended. Instead, they hardened into systems, laws, and expectations. Clean water, functioning sewers, and waste removal were no longer optional improvements. They became basic requirements of a modern city. Municipal authorities expanded their responsibilities, accepting that neglect had consequences too severe to ignore. This shift marked a profound change in governance. Cities were no longer just centers of trade and power, but environments that directly influence human survival. Yet progress brought new challenges. As sanitation improved, population density continued to rise. London remained a magnet for workers, migrants, and opportunity seekers. Clean streets did not mean spacious homes. Overcrowding persisted, and while diseases like cholera receded, other illnesses tied to poverty and poor nutrition remained common. Tuberculosis, rickets, and respiratory conditions continued to claim lives quietly, especially among the poor. The city had learned how to move waste underground, but it still struggled to lift people out of hardship. Urban reformers increasingly understood that dirt was not only physical, social conditions, low wages, insecure employment, and inadequate housing created invisible forms of filth that sanitation alone could not wash away. Investigations into living conditions revealed that even clean streets could surround lives marked by exhaustion and despair. This realization pushed reform beyond engineering and into social policy, though progress in this area remained slow and contested. The memory of Victorian filth also influenced architecture and city design. New buildings emphasized light, airflow, and separation of spaces. Schools, hospitals, and public institutions were designed to look orderly and clean, reflecting the belief that environment shaped behavior. Cleanliness became associated with progress, morality, and civilization itself. This mindset would later influence everything from housing estates to zoning laws. At the same time, London's reputation evolved. No longer widely mocked as the dirtiest city in the world, it began to present itself as a model of reform, a city that had confronted disaster and survived. Engineers, planners, and public officials from other nations studied London's transformation, adapting its solutions to their own cities. Ironically, the city's darkest period became the source of its greatest influence. Still, beneath this sense of achievement, unease remained. Londoners knew how close the city had come to collapse. The Great Stink, the cholera epidemics, and the endless smoke were not ancient history. They were recent memory. This awareness created a cautious attitude toward growth. Expansion was no longer celebrated blindly. Questions were asked. Systems were tested. The city learned, painfully, that ignoring basic human needs could turn progress into catastrophe. Daily life reflected this caution. Water quality was monitored. Streets were inspected. Housing standards, though imperfect, were debated. Newspapers continued to report on public health, keeping pressure on officials. The idea that filth could return if vigilance failed became widely accepted. Cleanliness was no longer a luxury. It was a defense. Yet, for all its improvements, London never fully escaped its past. The poorest neighborhoods still bore scars of neglect. Inequality ensured that while some lived in comfort, others hovered dangerously close to the conditions of earlier decades. The city had changed, but not evenly. Progress, like filth once had, settled heavier in some places than others. As the city moved forward, it carried a paradox. It had become cleaner because it had once been unbearably dirty. Its systems were stronger because they had failed so dramatically before. Victorian London's filth had forced humanity to confront uncomfortable truths about urban life, responsibility, and survival. As time passed, the memory of Victorian London's filth became something more than history. It became a warning. Even as new generations were born into cleaner streets and safer water supplies, the stories of the past lingered in books, newspapers, and public debate. Parents told their children about the days when the river stank, when sickness arrived without warning, and when entire neighborhoods were swallowed by disease. These memories shaped behavior in quiet but powerful ways. Public officials learned to fear complacency, the idea that neglect could return the city to its former state-haunted planning decisions. Budgets for sanitation and public health were defended with references to past disasters. Inspectors became permanent figures in city life, checking drains, water sources, and housing conditions. While these measures sometimes felt oppressive to residents, they were widely tolerated because people remembered what happened when no one was watching. Education reinforced this collective memory. Schools taught basic hygiene alongside reading and arithmetic. Cleanliness was framed not just as a personal habit, but as a civic duty. Children learned that one careless act, polluting water, ignoring waste, overcrowding a space, could affect thousands. This sense of shared responsibility marked a major cultural shift. The city was no longer just a place people lived in. It was something they had to actively protect. Architecture continued to reflect these fears and lessons. New housing developments prioritized separation between living spaces and waste systems. Windows were larger, ceilings higher, and ventilation deliberately planned. Even modest homes were influenced by the belief that light and air were defenses against decay. Though not everyone benefited equally, the ideal itself shaped expectations. People came to believe that living surrounded by filth was not natural or acceptable. It was a failure of systems, not destiny. The press played a key role in preserving this vigilance. Newspapers frequently revisited the horrors of the past, especially during times of crisis. A foul smell, a polluted stream, or a sudden outbreak of illness could trigger comparisons to Victorian disasters. These reminders kept public pressure alive. Politicians who ignored sanitation risked public outrage, not sympathy. Dirt had become political, yet memory also carried distortion. As time passed, the poorest residents were sometimes unfairly blamed for conditions beyond their control. Cleanliness became associated with morality, and those who lived in deteriorating areas were judged harshly. The fear of filth, once rooted in real danger, sometimes transformed into fear of people themselves. This complicated legacy showed how deeply Victorian London's past had embedded itself into social attitudes. The city's identity evolved alongside this memory. London was no longer merely a place of empire and industry. It became a case study in survival. Its transformation was cited in debates about urbanization across the world. Cities growing rapidly looked to London as proof that disaster could be avoided if lessons were learned early enough. Engineers and planners borrowed its solutions, but also its cautionary tales. Despite technological advances, Londoners remained aware that progress could be fragile. Floods, strikes, wars, and economic downturns all tested the systems built to keep the city clean. Each crisis revived old fears. The question was never just whether London was clean now, but whether it could stay that way. The past had taught the city that decay could return faster than expected. This awareness shaped responses to new challenges. When pollution shifted from visible waste to invisible threats like chemicals and smog, the city responded more quickly than it once had. The memory of coal-blackened skies made people more willing to confront environmental dangers. Victorian filth had trained London to recognize warning signs before catastrophe struck. Still, the tension between growth and care never disappeared. London continued to expand, drawing people into its orbit. Each expansion carried the risk of repeating old mistakes. Planners walked a narrow path between development and neglect, always shadowed by the city's history. As the story approaches its final chapter, one truth becomes clear. Victorian London was known as the dirtiest city in the world, not simply because it was filthy, but because it revealed what happens when progress outruns responsibility. Its dirt was a symptom, not the disease. The filth forced a reckoning, one that reshaped how cities understood themselves. As we come to the end of this long journey through Victorian London, it becomes clear that the city's reputation as the, quote, dirtiest city in the world was not simply a label of shame, but a turning point in human history. London's filth was not meaningless chaos. It was the visible result of a society moving faster than its understanding, a warning written in sewage, smoke, and sickness. And from that warning, lasting change emerged. Victorian London showed the world what happens when progress ignores people. Industry created wealth, but without planning, that wealth piled up alongside waste. Streets became rivers of filth. The air turned heavy and black. Water, once a source of life, became a carrier of death. The city grew powerful, but its people paid the price with their health and their lives. This contrast between greatness and neglect is what made Victorian London unforgettable. What followed was not instant redemption, but slow learning. The city did not wake up clean one morning. Instead, it struggled, argued, delayed, and failed again and again. But each failure left a lesson behind. The Great Stink forced Parliament to act. Cholera outbreaks shattered old beliefs. Engineers, doctors, and reformers pushed against indifference. Bit by bit, London learned that filth was not fate. It was a problem that could be solved. This realization changed everything. Sewers were no longer invisible conveniences. They became lifelines. Clean water became a right, not a privilege. Waste was managed, not ignored. Streets were designed, not abandoned. The city learned to think below the surface, understanding that what lay underground mattered just as much as what stood above. Perhaps the most important legacy of Victorian London's filth was the shift in responsibility. Dirt was no longer seen as a personal failing alone, but as a collective issue. Health became public business. Sanitation became a duty of government. Urban life itself was redefined. A city was no longer just a place of commerce and power. It was an environment that could either protect life or destroy it. This transformation reached far beyond London. Cities across Europe and the world watched closely. They learned from London's mistakes without always repeating them. Sewer systems, public health boards, housing regulations, and environmental awareness all trace part of their origins back to the crisis that once made London unbearable. In this way, the dirtiest city in the world helped shape the cleanest ideas of the modern age. Yet the story is not one of simple triumph. Even as London improved, inequality remained. Filth retreated, but poverty lingered. Clean streets did not guarantee fair wages or safe homes for everyone. The city became healthier, but not equal. Victorian London teaches us that infrastructure alone cannot fix injustice. It can only prevent disaster. The deeper work of fairness takes longer, and it is never fully finished. Still, the change was real. The choking smoke lifted slowly. The river began to recover. Death came less suddenly. Children lived longer. The city learned to breathe again. London did not erase its past. It absorbed it, built over it, and remembered it. Today, when we walk through modern cities with underground sewers, clean drinking water, waste collection, and public health systems, we are walking through the legacy of Victorian London's suffering. Every drain, every pipe, every sanitation rule carries the memory of a time when these things did not exist, and when their absence proved deadly. Victorian London was dirty not because its people were careless, but because they were pioneers in a world changing faster than knowledge could keep up. Their struggle gave future generations something invaluable: awareness. The awareness that cities must care for their weakest. That progress must be balanced with responsibility. That ignoring filth, physical or social, always carries a cost. So when history remembers Victorian London as the dirtiest city in the world, it should also remember it as the city that forced humanity to learn how to live together in vast numbers. Its filth became a lesson, its suffering became a foundation, and its transformation became a quiet promise that even the most broken systems can change. As the city settled into the modern age, the sounds of carts and coughing faded into memory. Gas lamps gave way to electric light. Sewers flowed silently beneath clean streets. The great city slept differently now, not free of problems, but wiser than before. And now, as this story comes to rest, imagine Victorian London at night. The streets are quieter. The river moves slowly beneath the bridges. The smoke thins. The city, once drowning in its own waste, finally exhales. Thank you for traveling through this history. If you found peace in this slow journey through the past, remember to like and subscribe for more stories meant to calm the mind and carry you gently into rest. Good night. Welcome to our channel, where we explore the quiet, often forgotten corners of history. Tonight we begin a long journey into Victorian London, a city of extreme contrasts, where unimaginable wealth and crushing poverty existed side by side. This story will slowly reveal where the rich lived, where the poor struggled to survive, and how invisible boundaries shaped everyday life in one of the most powerful cities the world had ever seen. As the gas lamps flicker and the streets grow quiet, we'll walk through elegant avenues and dark alleyways alike, uncovering a city divided not by walls, but by class, money, and opportunity. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like this video if you enjoy slow, immersive history made for rest and reflection. And let us know in the comments from which location you're watching, whether it's late at night or early morning. We love reading where our listeners are drifting in from around the world. Victorian London was not one city, but many cities layered on top of one another. To a visitor arriving in the mid-19th century, London appeared vast and unstoppable. Its skyline was filled with church spires, factory chimneys, and rows of tightly packed houses stretching farther than the eye could see. Horse-drawn carriages rattled across cobbled streets, while riverboats crowded the Thames. Yet behind this spectacle lay a harsh truth. Where you lived in London determined almost everything about your life, your health, your safety, your future, and even how long you were likely to live. The wealthy lived in wide streets, lined with elegant townhouses, especially in areas like the West End. Neighborhoods such as Mayfair, Belgravia, and Kensington were carefully planned, clean, and orderly. These districts featured grand homes built of stone and brick, with tall windows, iron railings, and polished front doors. Inside, rooms were spacious, warmed by fireplaces, and lit by chandeliers or oil lamps. Servants moved quietly through back staircases, ensuring that life for the wealthy remained comfortable and undisturbed. In these districts, the air felt different. Streets were swept regularly, waste was removed, and sewage systems, though still imperfect, were far better maintained than elsewhere in the city. Trees lined the roads, parks were nearby, and the noise of factories was kept at a distance. For the rich, London was a place of culture and refinement. They attended theaters, concerts, dinner parties, and balls. Children were educated at home or sent to prestigious schools, shielded from the harsh realities only a few miles away. Yet just a short walk or carriage ride from these refined streets, the city transformed completely. As one moved eastward, the houses grew smaller, the streets narrower, and the smell heavier. This was East London, home to the working poor, where entire families crowded into single rooms. In districts like Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and Bethnal Green, poverty shaped every aspect of daily life. Buildings were old, damp, and crumbling. Many homes lacked running water or proper toilets. Waste flowed openly through gutters, and the air was thick with smoke from factories and coal fires. The poor lived where rent was cheapest, even if it meant danger. Landlords often divided houses into multiple tiny rooms, renting each one to a different family. These tenements were overcrowded beyond imagination. In some cases, 6 or more people slept in one small room, sharing a single bed or taking turns sleeping. Disease spread rapidly in such conditions, and outbreaks of cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis were common. The poor did not choose these neighborhoods out of preference. They lived there because they had nowhere else to go. Class separation in Victorian London was not accidental. The city's layout reflected deep social beliefs about wealth, morality, and worth. The rich believed poverty was a moral failing, and many preferred to keep the poor out of sight. This led to a physical separation of communities. Wide roads, railway lines, and commercial districts often acted as invisible borders between rich and poor neighborhoods. Crossing from one side to the other felt like entering an entirely different world. The River Thames itself symbolized this divide. While wealthy Londoners enjoyed river views from clean embankments and bridges, the poor depended on the river for work and survival. Dock workers, boatmen, and laborers lived close to the docks in overcrowded housing, exposed to pollution and danger. The river carried waste, sewage, and industrial runoff, making it both a lifeline and a health hazard. For the rich, the Thames was scenery. For the poor, it was survival. Transportation also reinforced inequality. The wealthy traveled in private carriages, or later by train, allowing them to live farther from their workplaces in cleaner areas. The poor walked everywhere. Long journeys to factories, docks, or markets consumed hours each day, leaving little time for rest. This meant the poor had to live close to their work, often near noisy, polluted industrial zones where housing was cheapest, but conditions were worst. Children born into these areas inherited their surroundings. A child raised in Belgravia grew up surrounded by books, tutors, and opportunity. A child born in Whitechapel grew up surrounded by hunger, labor, and danger. These neighborhoods shaped expectations early. For the poor, survival came before education. Many children worked from a young age, contributing to household income through factory labor, street selling, or domestic service. Where a child lived often decided the course of their entire life. Despite the hardship, poor communities were not without resilience. Neighbors relied on one another for support, sharing food, information, and protection. Streets were alive with human activity, vendors shouting, children playing, workers returning home late at night. Life was harsh, but it was also deeply communal. In contrast, wealthy districts were quieter, more private, and socially controlled. Doors closed early, and interactions were formal and limited. Victorian London thrived on this imbalance. The labor of the poor powered the comfort of the rich. Factories, docks, railways, and workshops relied on workers who lived in the most deprived districts. Yet those workers rarely benefited from the wealth they helped create. The city grew richer, but the divide between neighborhoods grew deeper. As night fell over London, gas lamps illuminated only certain streets. In wealthy areas, they cast a warm, steady glow. In poor districts, darkness lingered longer, broken only by flickering lights from pubs or factories working through the night. Safety, like comfort, depended on where you lived. By the middle of the Victorian era, London had become the largest city in the world, both in population and influence. Its expansion was rapid and relentless, pulling people from rural villages and foreign lands into its crowded streets. Yet this growth did not happen evenly. While the wealthy retreated into carefully designed neighborhoods, the poor were compressed into ever smaller spaces, forced to adapt to conditions that grew worse with each passing year. In the West End, architecture reflected power and permanence. Townhouses were built in uniform rows, designed to project stability and elegance. Each home had multiple floors, separating public and private life. Drawing rooms were placed on the first floor to receive guests, while bedrooms sat above, removed from street noise. Kitchens and servant quarters were tucked away below ground or at the back of the house, keeping labor invisible. These buildings were symbols of order, hierarchy, and control. In stark contrast, housing for the poor was chaotic and improvised. Many buildings in East London had been constructed centuries earlier, never intended to hold so many people. As the population grew, landlords subdivided homes again and again. Hallways became bedrooms. Cellars became living spaces, even though they flooded regularly with sewage-tainted water. In some areas, entire families lived underground, receiving little light or fresh air. One of the most infamous forms of housing for the poor was the lodging house. These establishments offered beds by the night, sometimes by the hour. For a few pennies, a person could sleep in a shared room packed with strangers. Some lodging houses were so overcrowded that ropes were strung across rooms, allowing people to lean forward and sleep standing up. Privacy did not exist. Safety was uncertain. Yet, for many, these places were the only alternative to sleeping on the streets. The streets themselves became living spaces for the poorest Londoners. Those without money for rent slept under bridges, in doorways, or along alleyways. Entire communities formed among the homeless, creating their own rules and support systems. Street life was dangerous, especially at night, but it also offered a strange sense of freedom for those who had nowhere else to go. Wealthier Londoners often avoided these districts entirely. Newspapers described them as dangerous, immoral, and diseased. Fear of crime and illness reinforced social separation. Many believed that simply entering poor neighborhoods posed a risk to health and reputation. This fear allowed conditions to worsen unchecked, as long as they remained out of sight. Public health became a growing concern as epidemics spread across class boundaries. Cholera outbreaks revealed that disease did not respect social divisions. Even the wealthy could not fully escape the consequences of overcrowded slums. Slowly, this realization led to calls for reform, yet early improvements were limited and uneven, often focused more on protecting wealthy areas than improving poor ones. Infrastructure followed wealth. Clean water, sewers, paved roads, and lighting were introduced first in affluent districts. Poor neighborhoods waited years, sometimes decades, for the same improvements. Even when changes arrived, they were often poorly executed or insufficient for the population density. As a result, inequality became built into the city itself. Employment tied people to place. Dock workers lived near docks. Factory workers lived near factories. Domestic servants often lived inside wealthy homes, sleeping in attics or basements, separated physically and socially from their employers, despite sharing the same building. This created strange overlaps, extreme wealth and extreme poverty under one roof, yet worlds apart. Children navigated these spaces differently. Wealthy children played in private gardens and parks. Poor children claimed the streets as their playgrounds, learning early how to avoid danger, earn money, and survive. These streets taught lessons no school ever would. As London continued to expand outward, suburbs began to form for the middle and upper classes. Railways allowed those with money to escape the city center entirely, leaving behind the poorest residents. This outward movement deepened inner-city poverty, concentrating hardship in specific districts. The physical map of Victorian London became a social map. Every street told a story of class, power, and survival. Where you lived shaped how others saw you and how you saw yourself. And as we move further into this story, we will see how these divided spaces affected crime, family life, and the daily rhythms of survival in a city that never truly slept. As Victorian London pressed forward into the later decades of the 19th century, the divide between where the rich and poor lived became not just visible, but deeply entrenched. The city no longer merely reflected inequality, it enforced it. Entire neighborhoods carried reputations that followed their residents wherever they went. An address could determine whether a person was trusted, feared, ignored, or welcomed. To live in a certain street was to carry its stigma or prestige like a permanent mark. In wealthy districts, daily life unfolded with a sense of predictability and control. Streets were wide enough for carriages to pass comfortably, and pavements were kept clean. Police patrols were frequent, ensuring order and discouraging crime. Shops sold luxury goods, tailored clothing, fine china, imported foods, items far beyond the reach of the working poor. Social life revolved around formal visits, scheduled events, and private gatherings. Even leisure was structured, occurring in theaters, clubs, and manicured parks designed to exclude those who did not belong. Meanwhile, in the poorest districts, life followed a different rhythm entirely. Streets were narrow and crowded, often clogged with people, animals, carts, and refuse. The smell of waste, smoke, and unwashed bodies lingered in the air. Noise never truly faded. Factories operated late into the night. Taverns spilled music and shouting into the streets, and arguments echoed through thin walls. Privacy was almost non-existent, and survival required constant awareness of one's surroundings. Crime flourished where poverty concentrated, not necessarily because the poor were more criminal, but because desperation left few alternatives. Pickpocketing, petty theft, and street scams were common, especially in overcrowded areas where anonymity was easy. Children learned early how to navigate these dangers, both as potential victims and, sometimes, as participants. For many, crime was not a moral choice but a practical one, shaped by hunger and lack of opportunity. Policing reflected class bias. In wealthy areas, the police were protectors. In poor districts, they were often viewed with suspicion or fear. Arrests were frequent, and punishment was harsh. A minor offense in a slum could result in imprisonment, while similar behavior in affluent areas might be overlooked. This uneven enforcement deepened resentment and reinforced the belief that the law existed to protect property rather than people. Housing conditions continued to deteriorate as London's population surged. New arrivals, immigrants, rural laborers, and displaced families poured into already overcrowded neighborhoods. With little regulation, landlords prioritized profit over safety. Buildings were rarely repaired, roofs leaked, walls cracked, and staircases collapsed. Fires were common and devastating, spreading quickly through tightly packed wooden structures. When disaster struck, the poor had nowhere else to go. Some reformers began to document these conditions, walking through slums and recording what they saw. Their reports shocked those who had never ventured beyond the comfort of the West End. Descriptions of families living alongside rats, children sleeping on bare floors, and entire streets without access to clean water challenged the belief that poverty was simply a result of laziness. Yet awareness did not always lead to action. Many preferred to believe that such suffering was unavoidable, or worse, deserved. Work dictated where people lived, and work itself was changing. Industrial employment was unstable. Factories closed suddenly, docks hired by the day, and illness could mean instant unemployment. Without savings, missing even a few days of work could result in eviction. This constant insecurity kept families trapped in cheap housing, unable to move even when conditions became unbearable. Women faced particular challenges shaped by geography. In wealthy districts, women managed households, supervised servants, and raised children within sheltered environments. In poor areas, women often worked long hours in factories, laundries, or as street vendors, while also caring for children and maintaining households. Many took in laundry or sewing work to supplement income. Some turned to prostitution, especially in districts where poverty was most severe. These neighborhoods became known not just for deprivation, but for moral judgment imposed by outsiders. Children's experiences were defined by their surroundings. In affluent areas, childhood was increasingly seen as a protected stage of life, filled with education, play, and preparation for adulthood. In poor districts, childhood was brief. Children contributed economically as soon as they were able, whether by working, begging, or caring for siblings. Streets became classrooms, teaching lessons of resilience, caution, and endurance. Religious institutions played different roles across the city. In wealthy neighborhoods, churches were social centers, reinforcing status and respectability. In poor areas, missions and charitable organizations provided food, shelter, and sometimes education. These institutions often stood as rare places of refuge. Yet even charity carried conditions, offering help alongside strict moral expectations. Assistance could be withdrawn if recipients failed to meet standards set by those who had never lived their hardships. Despite everything, poor communities developed their own forms of strength. Neighbors watched over each other's children, shared meals when possible, and passed along information about work opportunities. Informal networks replaced the support systems the city failed to provide. These bonds did not eliminate suffering, but they made it survivable. The physical separation between rich and poor grew more deliberate as the century progressed. Urban planning favored wealth. New roads and developments pushed slums farther from view, isolating poverty rather than addressing it. Railways cut through neighborhoods, displacing residents without compensation. While the city modernized, many of its poorest inhabitants were simply moved aside. Public debates about housing reform began to emerge, driven by fears of disease, unrest, and moral decay. Some recognized that neglecting entire sections of the city posed risks to everyone. Early efforts to improve housing focused on demolition rather than rehabilitation, destroying slums without providing adequate alternatives. This often worsened homelessness, forcing families into even tighter spaces elsewhere. As London approached the end of the Victorian era, the map of the city told a silent story of inequality. The grand avenues and hidden alleys existed within the same city limits, yet might as well have been worlds apart. Daily life unfolded according to geography, shaping behavior, expectations, and futures. The place where one lived was not simply an address, it was destiny. And as the city continued to grow and reform slowly stirred, these divided spaces would play a crucial role in shaping public policy, social movements, and the struggles that lay ahead, as Victorian London stood on the edge of a new century, still burdened by the shadows of its own design. As the Victorian era moved toward its later years, the boundaries between rich and poor neighborhoods in London became not only physical but psychological. People learned early which streets to avoid, which accents to hide, and which addresses to never mention aloud. Reputation clung to place. A man from Mayfair was assumed respectable before he spoke a word. A woman from Whitechapel was judged long before she explained herself. These assumptions shaped opportunity, trust, and fear, reinforcing a city divided by invisible lines. Daily routines reflected this divide in subtle but powerful ways. In wealthy districts, mornings began quietly. Servants rose early to light fires, prepare breakfast, and open curtains, allowing the household to wake into comfort. Deliveries arrived punctually. Fresh bread, milk, newspapers, brought by workers who would never live nearby. Children were dressed carefully and escorted to lessons or tutors, their futures mapped out years in advance. Time felt abundant, structured, and predictable. In poorer districts, mornings arrived with urgency. Families woke before dawn, often after restless nights interrupted by noise, cold, or hunger. There was no time for preparation beyond necessity. A quick meal, if one could be afforded, and then the rush to work began. Mothers carried infants, while older children were sent into the streets to earn what they could. Fathers searched for day labor, uncertain whether wages would come at all. Time here was scarce and fragile, measured not by clocks, but by survival. The design of the city reinforced these rhythms. Wealthy areas had access to green spaces, parks where residents could walk, breathe cleaner air, and escape the press of urban life. These parks were carefully maintained, monitored, and, in practice, exclusive. Poor districts had few such spaces. Streets doubled as playgrounds, marketplaces, and gathering places. Children played beside open drains. Conversations took place in doorways and alleys. Life unfolded publicly, leaving little room for rest or retreat. Education followed geography. Schools in affluent areas were well-funded, orderly, and focused on refinement as much as instruction. Discipline was strict but purposeful, designed to mold future leaders. In poor areas, schools were overcrowded or non-existent. Many children attended irregularly, pulled out whenever money was needed. Education was seen as a luxury, valuable but impractical when hunger was immediate. This gap widened over generations, ensuring that social mobility remained rare. Health outcomes reflected living conditions. Wealthy families could afford doctors, rest, and clean environments. Illness was inconvenient, but rarely fatal. In poor districts, disease was constant. Minor injuries became serious infections. Contagion spread quickly through crowded homes. Life expectancy was drastically lower, and death was a familiar presence. Funerals passed through streets weekly, sometimes daily, reinforcing a quiet acceptance of loss. The press played a role in shaping perceptions of these neighborhoods. Newspapers often sensationalized slums, portraying them as breeding grounds of vice and danger. Stories emphasized crime and disorder, rarely addressing the structural causes behind them. This portrayal justified neglect and reinforced fear. Few articles explored the lives of the poor with empathy. Instead, distance was maintained, allowing the wealthy to view suffering as something separate from themselves. Charity became one of the few bridges between classes, though it was uneven and conditional. Philanthropic organizations distributed food, clothing, and shelter, often concentrated in the most desperate districts. Yet charity rarely addressed long-term needs. Aid was temporary, controlled, and moralized. Recipients were expected to demonstrate gratitude and obedience. While some lives were eased, the underlying inequalities remained untouched. Women in poor districts bore the weight of these conditions heavily. They managed households under impossible circumstances, stretched resources beyond reason, and endured constant stress. Many worked outside the home, returning late to care for children and maintain living spaces that offered little comfort. Their labor was invisible to much of society, yet essential. In contrast, women in wealthy areas managed comfort rather than scarcity, supported by servants and social networks that protected them from the city's harsher realities. The streets themselves told stories of division. In the West End, shops displayed luxury behind polished glass. In the East End, goods spilled onto pavements, used clothing, cheap food, tools sold secondhand. Markets thrived where regulation was light, filling gaps left by formal systems. These informal economies sustained entire communities, even as authorities viewed them with suspicion. Transportation reinforced separation. Omnibuses and later trains allowed the wealthy to travel without interacting with poorer neighborhoods. Routes were designed to serve commercial and affluent districts first. For the poor, walking remained the primary means of movement, limiting access to opportunities elsewhere in the city. Distance became another barrier, quietly maintaining inequality. As reform movements gained momentum, debates about housing intensified. Some argued that improving living conditions would uplift the poor. Others feared that better housing would encourage dependency or moral decline. Progress was slow, compromised by politics and prejudice. Early housing projects often displaced residents without offering real alternatives, fracturing communities that had survived through mutual support. Children growing up in these environments absorbed these realities without explanation. They learned which streets were safe, which faces could be trusted, and how to move unnoticed. Their understanding of the city was intimate and practical, shaped by necessity rather than privilege. This knowledge, though invaluable, came at the cost of innocence. Despite all this, hope persisted quietly. People adapted, resisted, and endured. Small improvements, cleaner water in one street, a new schoolroom, a charitable kitchen were celebrated. Change, when it came, arrived slowly and unevenly, but it arrived because people refused to disappear quietly. As London approached the turn of the century, pressure mounted for deeper reform. The stark contrast between neighborhoods could no longer be ignored entirely. The city had grown too large, too connected, for inequality to remain hidden forever. The spaces where people lived had shaped generations, and those shapes were now influencing politics, public health, and social thought. And as these forces gathered strength, Victorian London stood at a threshold, still divided by wealth and poverty, yet beginning, almost imperceptibly, to question whether such divisions could endure unchanged into the future. As the 19th century edged closer to its end, Victorian London existed in a state of contradiction. It was a city celebrated as the heart of a global empire, yet sustained by neighborhoods that lived in constant deprivation. The geography of wealth and poverty was no longer accidental or temporary. It had become institutional. Streets, buildings, and entire districts were shaped by decisions that favored some lives over others, embedding inequality into brick and stone. In affluent areas, homes continued to grow more elaborate. Renovations modernized interiors with improved plumbing, gas lighting, and later, electricity. These advancements were introduced first, where money already flowed, reinforcing comfort and safety. The wealthy experienced progress as convenience, barely noticing the systems that supported it. Servants managed waste, coal deliveries, and household maintenance, ensuring that life remained orderly and uninterrupted. In contrast, the poor lived with progress as disruption. Infrastructure projects designed to modernize the city often cut directly through working-class neighborhoods. Roads widened, railways expanded, and buildings were demolished, pushing residents into even tighter spaces. Compensation was rare, relocation unsupported. Families displaced by improvements found themselves further east, further south, or deeper into already crowded streets, carrying their lives with them in bundles and sacks. These disruptions weakened community bonds that had taken decades to form. Streets that once provided mutual support vanished overnight. People who relied on neighbors for childcare, food sharing, or informal work were scattered. While reformers spoke of sanitation and order, the human cost of these changes went largely unacknowledged. Employment opportunities remained tied to geography. Docklands, factories, and workshops anchored people to specific districts. Even when wages were barely enough to survive, workers stayed close to their livelihoods because travel was costly and time-consuming. This tethering ensured that poverty remained concentrated, reproducing itself within the same streets generation after generation. Housing reform became a subject of debate rather than action. Model dwellings were constructed, often presented as solutions to slum conditions. These buildings offered cleaner environments and better layouts, but rents were frequently higher than what the poorest could afford. As a result, those most in need were excluded. The very people meant to benefit were left behind, watching improvements pass them by. Social attitudes hardened. Many in wealthier districts viewed poverty as inevitable or self-inflicted. Distance made empathy abstract. Charity was praised, but structural change was resisted. Helping the poor was acceptable, but living near them was not. This mindset influenced urban planning, zoning, and policy, ensuring continued separation between classes. Children growing up in poor districts inherited these realities with little explanation. They learned the boundaries of the city through experience. Certain streets promised work, others promised danger. Some areas felt unreachable, existing only in stories or glimpses from afar. These children developed resilience early, but that resilience came at the cost of opportunity. Women, especially widows and single mothers, faced constant precarity. Housing insecurity loomed over every illness, every missed wage. Landlords held power with few restrictions. Evictions were swift, often executed with little warning. Possessions were left in the street, families scrambling to find shelter. The city offered no safety net, only temporary relief from overstretched charities. Nightfall deepened contrasts. In wealthy areas, homes glowed warmly behind curtains. Streets quieted, protected by patrols and lighting. In poorer districts, night intensified hardship. Work continued late. Taverns overflowed with those seeking warmth or escape. Crime rose, not from malice alone, but from desperation sharpened by darkness. Despite this, cultural life flourished in unexpected ways. Music halls, street performances, and informal gatherings provided relief from relentless strain. Storytelling, humor, and shared rituals sustained morale. These expressions rarely crossed class boundaries, remaining rooted in local communities, unseen by those who lived elsewhere. The city's political landscape began to shift under the weight of these divisions. Public health crises forced acknowledgement that neglect carried consequences. Disease spread beyond slums. Labor unrest disrupted commerce. Gradually, conversations about responsibilities surfaced. Still, progress lagged behind need, slowed by resistance and fear of change. Transportation improvements continued to benefit the middle and upper classes disproportionately. Suburban expansion allowed those with means to escape the city center entirely. This outward movement drained resources and attention from inner districts, further isolating the poor. London expanded outward while its core hardened. Maps of the city told a quiet truth. Wealth clustered westward and outward. Poverty pressed inward and eastward. These patterns were discussed in reports, debated in meetings, and then largely preserved. The city functioned efficiently because inequality kept it so. Yet beneath this rigid structure, dissatisfaction grew. Voices emerged demanding better housing, fair wages, and public accountability. These voices often originated within poor communities themselves, shaped by lived experience rather than theory. Change, when it came, would not arrive gently. As the Victorian era prepared to give way to a new century, London stood divided but restless. The spaces where people lived had shaped their lives for decades. Those spaces now began to shape the future of the city itself, setting the stage for conflict, reform, and transformation still to come. And as these pressures mounted quietly beneath the surface, the city continued its endless motion. Carriages rolling, factories humming, families enduring, unaware that the geography of their lives was about to face its most serious challenge yet. As the turn of the century approached, Victorian London stood heavy with the weight of its own contradictions. The physical separation between rich and poor neighborhoods had shaped not only daily life, but the collective conscience of the city. What once felt permanent now began to feel unstable. The same streets that carried wealth outward also carried discontent inward, and the imbalance that had defined London for decades could no longer exist without consequence. In wealthy districts, comfort continued largely uninterrupted. Households adopted new technologies with ease. Indoor plumbing, improved heating, and better lighting arrived quietly, blending into everyday life. These advances made homes healthier and more secure, further insulating residents from the hardships elsewhere. Distance, both physical and emotional, allowed many to believe that progress was universal, that the city as a whole was moving forward together. But in poorer areas, change arrived unevenly and often painfully. Improvements to sanitation and housing were discussed far more than they were delivered. When action did come, it was frequently disruptive. Entire streets were demolished in the name of public health, forcing residents to relocate with little notice or support. Families already struggling were uprooted again, pushed deeper into overcrowded districts where rents rose and space shrank further. The language of reform often failed to include the voices of those most affected. Plans were drawn by officials who rarely visited the neighborhoods they sought to redesign. Solutions emphasized order and efficiency over stability and community. The poor were treated as a problem to be managed, rather than people to be supported. This disconnect deepened mistrust between classes and fueled growing resentment. Work remained central to survival, yet employment grew more uncertain. Mechanization reduced the need for manual labor in some industries, while competition for jobs intensified in others. Casual work dominated the lives of many, offering no guarantees. 1 week of steady wages could be followed by weeks of unemployment. Housing insecurity mirrored this instability, with families constantly at risk of displacement. Children felt these pressures acutely. Many grew up moving from one street to another, rarely settling long enough to form lasting ties. School attendance remained inconsistent, interrupted by work, illness, or eviction. Childhood, already brief, became fragmented, yet children adapted quickly, learning how to read their environments, how to navigate danger, and how to contribute to survival in whatever way they could. Public concern over these conditions slowly intensified. Reports, photographs, and testimonies brought the realities of slum life into wider view. Middle-class reformers began visiting poor districts, documenting what they saw. Some were motivated by compassion, others by fear of unrest. Regardless of motive, attention increased, and with it, pressure for meaningful change. Housing reform became a central focus. New ideas emerged about responsibility and public investment. The notion that decent living conditions were a public good, not merely a private concern, gained ground, yet implementation remained cautious. Funding was limited. Resistance persisted. Many feared that improving conditions would undermine social order or encourage dependency. At the same time, the city's population continued to shift. Immigration brought new communities into already crowded areas. These newcomers often settled where rents were lowest, adding cultural diversity but also intensifying competition for housing and work. Tensions arose, shaped by scarcity rather than difference alone. The city became more complex, layered with overlapping struggles. Wealthy areas, meanwhile, began to retreat further from the city center. Suburban living expanded, supported by railways and trams. Those with means increasingly chose distance over proximity, reducing contact with inner-city poverty. This withdrawal drained political urgency from reform efforts, allowing conditions in poor districts to persist largely unchanged. Yet the city could not fully escape itself. Public health crises continued to expose interdependence. Disease traveled across boundaries. Labor strikes disrupted supply chains. Crime, born of desperation, affected commerce and security. The separation that once protected wealth now proved incomplete. Women in poor neighborhoods remained pillars of resilience. They managed households through uncertainty, maintained social ties, and carried emotional burdens quietly. Their labor sustained families and communities, though it remained largely invisible to official records. In wealthy areas, women increasingly participated in reform movements, advocating for housing, health, and education, often without fully grasping the daily realities they sought to change. Cultural narratives about poverty began to shift slightly. Literature, journalism, and public discourse started to reflect complexity rather than caricature. Stories of endurance, not just failure, reached wider audiences. This shift did not immediately alter conditions, but it softened some assumptions and opened space for dialogue. By the final years of the Victorian era, London felt poised between endurance and transformation. The geography of inequality had shaped generations, but it was no longer unquestioned. The city's vast scale made change slow, but momentum was building beneath the surface. Streets remained crowded, homes remained unequal, lives continued along familiar paths. Yet beneath routine, expectations were shifting. The idea that where one lived should determine one's worth began to weaken, challenged by experience, exposure, and necessity. As the old century prepared to close, London carried its divisions forward, but also its lessons. The spaces that separated rich and poor had revealed the cost of neglect and the limits of distance. What came next would be shaped by whether the city chose to preserve those divisions or finally confront them. And as night fell once more over its rooftops and alleyways, the city rested uneasily, carrying within it both the weight of its past and the uncertain promise of what lay ahead. As the Victorian era drew closer to its end, London's divisions became impossible to ignore, even for those who had spent their lives insulated from them. The city was no longer just expanding outward. It was pressing inward, forcing questions that could not be answered with distance alone. The places where people lived had created a social map that governed behavior, expectation, and fate. This map, once accepted as natural, now appeared increasingly fragile. In poorer districts, daily life continued with relentless intensity. Families woke each morning unsure of what the day would bring. Employment remained unstable, and wages rarely kept pace with rising rents. A single setback, a lost job, an illness, a landlord's decision, could unravel everything. Housing insecurity became a constant companion, shaping decisions large and small. People learned not to accumulate possessions they might have to abandon quickly. Life was lived lightly, not by choice, but by necessity. Neighborhoods adapted to this instability in practical ways. Informal systems of support developed, built on trust and familiarity rather than contracts. Landladies allowed late payments when possible. Neighbors shared childcare or meals. Information about work opportunities passed quickly from door to door. These systems were fragile, but they sustained communities where official systems failed to reach. In wealthy areas, life remained shielded from such uncertainty. Residents benefited from predictability, steady incomes, secure housing, and access to services that responded quickly to need. This stability allowed long-term planning. Futures could be imagined with confidence. Children were prepared for roles that mirrored their parents' status, reinforcing continuity across generations. The physical landscape reinforced these differences. New buildings in affluent districts were designed with permanence in mind. Materials were durable, layouts spacious. In contrast, housing for the poor remained temporary in spirit, even when constructed of brick. Repairs were minimal. Investment was cautious. Buildings were seen as expendable, reflecting the way their occupants were viewed. Public discourse increasingly framed poverty as a problem of environment rather than character. This shift was subtle but significant. The recognition that living conditions shaped behavior and health began to influence thinking. Reformers argued that overcrowding, not moral weakness, produced crime and illness. This perspective challenged long-held beliefs and threatened the comfort of simple explanations. Still, resistance was strong. Many feared that acknowledging structural causes would require structural solutions that might redistribute resources or alter power. Debates stalled. Progress came in fragments. Improvements were localized, incremental, and often symbolic. Transportation continued to shape opportunity. Railways and trams expanded access for those who could afford fares, while the poorest remained confined to walking distance. This confinement limited job prospects and reinforced neighborhood isolation. The city grew more connected, yet those connections were unevenly accessible. Children growing up in poor districts developed a complex understanding of these boundaries. They knew which streets offered opportunity and which promised trouble. They learned to navigate authority carefully, to appear compliant when necessary and invisible when possible. These skills were survival tools, though they carried long-term consequences for confidence and trust. Education reform progressed slowly. Attendance improved in some areas, but overcrowding and underfunding limited effectiveness. Schools reflected their neighborhoods, struggling where poverty was greatest. Yet even limited education offered moments of escape, windows into worlds beyond immediate surroundings. For some children, these moments planted seeds that would later grow into demands for change. Women remained central to the fabric of poor communities. Their labor, emotional and physical, held families together under immense pressure. They negotiated with landlords, managed scarce resources, and provided care across generations. Their strength rarely entered public narratives, yet without it, entire neighborhoods would have collapsed. In affluent areas, some women increasingly engaged in reform efforts. Visiting poor districts, organizing charities, and advocating for housing improvements, they bridged social divides cautiously. These encounters were often shaped by misunderstanding, but they also introduced empathy into spaces long dominated by distance. The city's institutions began to respond, if unevenly. Local councils experimented with housing initiatives. Health boards expanded sanitation efforts. These actions signaled recognition, though not resolution. Implementation lagged behind rhetoric, constrained by funding, politics, and hesitation. Cultural life continued to reflect division. Entertainment in wealthy areas emphasized refinement and exclusivity. In poorer districts, culture was communal and improvised. Music, storytelling, shared rituals that required little beyond participation. These expressions sustained identity and dignity, even as external judgment dismissed them. As the Victorian age neared its close, London existed in a state of tension between endurance and transformation. The old order persisted, but cracks were visible. The geography of inequality had shaped generations, yet it was no longer beyond question. The city's future depended on whether these questions would lead to meaningful change or be absorbed into familiar patterns of delay. For now, life continued much as before. Streets remained crowded. Homes remained unequal. Lives unfolded along paths defined by place. Yet beneath routine, something had shifted. Awareness had spread. Expectations had changed. The idea that the city could remain divided without consequence was fading. And as London moved toward a new century, carrying its burdens forward, the places where people lived continued to tell their stories of endurance, exclusion, and the quiet insistence that space, like society, could be reshaped. As the 19th century finally gave way to the 20th, Victorian London stood transformed, yet unresolved. The city had grown larger, richer, and more complex than anyone could have imagined at the start of the era. But beneath its expanding streets and rising buildings, the question of where people lived and why remained at the heart of everything. The long-standing divide between rich and poor neighborhoods had shaped not only daily life, but the moral landscape of the city itself. For decades, the wealthy had lived buffered from hardship, protected by distance, infrastructure, and influence. Their homes stood as symbols of permanence and privilege, built to last and designed to comfort. These neighborhoods benefited first from every improvement the city offered: cleaner water, better sanitation, safer streets. Progress arrived quietly and stayed. Life here felt stable, predictable, and secure. For the poor, life had been defined by uncertainty. Homes were temporary in spirit, even when made of brick. Streets were crowded, loud, and often unsafe. Entire families lived at the mercy of landlords, employers, and illness. A single disruption could dismantle everything. These neighborhoods carried the weight of the city's labor, yet received the least protection from its systems. Survival depended on adaptability, resilience, and community bonds forged under pressure. By the end of the Victorian era, however, something subtle but important had changed. The suffering of the poor could no longer be dismissed as invisible. Reports, investigations, and lived experience had exposed the consequences of neglect. Disease, unrest, and inequality had proven that separation did not mean insulation. The city had learned, slowly and reluctantly, that its divisions affected everyone. Housing reform, though incomplete, had begun to reshape thinking. The idea that decent living conditions were a shared responsibility gained cautious acceptance. Some new housing projects offered safer environments, even if they failed to reach those most in need. Public health initiatives expanded, acknowledging that clean water and sanitation were necessities rather than luxuries. These steps were small, but they marked a shift in attitude. Education reform, too, began to alter the future. More children attended school regularly, gaining skills their parents never had access to. While poverty still limited opportunity, knowledge created possibility. The rigid certainty that a child's life would mirror their surroundings weakened slightly. Hope entered spaces where it had long been absent. The city itself evolved. Transportation expanded, connecting neighborhoods in new ways. Communication increased. The flow of people and ideas blurred some boundaries, even as others remained. The stark geography of wealth and poverty softened at the edges, though it did not disappear. London remained unequal, but it was no longer unquestioned. Communities carried forward their lessons. In poor districts, resilience and cooperation endured. People who had survived the worst conditions brought with them an understanding of mutual dependence. In wealthier areas, awareness grew, uneven and incomplete, but present. The notion that comfort came without cost became harder to maintain. The legacy of Victorian London's divided neighborhoods lived on into the new century. The patterns established during those years continued to influence housing, policy, and opportunity. Streets remembered their past. Buildings carried stories in their walls. Lives unfolded within spaces shaped by choices made long before. Yet the city was no longer static. Change, once resisted, now seemed inevitable. The future would bring new challenges and new divisions, but also new possibilities. The story of where the rich and poor lived in Victorian London became a lesson, a reminder of what happens when space is used to separate rather than support. As night settles over the city one last time in our story, imagine London at rest. Gas lamps dim. Footsteps fade. Houses of every kind grow quiet. Behind grand facades and crumbling walls alike, people sleep, carrying with them the weight of their histories and the promise of what tomorrow might bring. The streets that once divided now lie still, holding memories of struggle, endurance, and change. And as the city breathes in the quiet hours before dawn, it waits, always waiting, for the next chapter to begin. Good night.